This is a Suehiro Chemical Stone 320 grit. I've only been using it for the past little while, but a couple of interesting things came up that I just want to make a point of, because some of them are relatively dramatic in that they influence, or should influence, how people evaluate stones, but they don't. And it can have a critical effect on your perception of the stone because it dramatically changes the way the stone works. So this stone is rather interesting because it has a big number 800 wrote on the box, but that refers to the part number. The grit is actually 320, but in most cases you'll see it described as an 800 grit stone, again in reference to the part number. The interesting thing is, when I got this stone, it behaved very different from the description that's on the website, Tools from Japan. And Stu, the guy who runs that, is a fairly knowledgeable fellow, so I was quite surprised. One of the first things that I do, that I've been doing lately anyway, to give a check on a stone, is I take this fairly well used Mora, 1095, around 60 Rockwell. I put a mirror finish on one side of the blade, then I lay it against the stone and just do 50 passes up and down, and then I can look at the scratch pattern. And because the blade was mirror polished before I put it on the stone, I see the exact scratch pattern of the stone, no other interference. When I did that with this stone when I first got it, the results were horrible. Again, 1095 at 60 Rockwell. Not exactly difficult to grind. The stone barely cut it. The stone had very poor cutting ability. It glazed very easily. Loaded up. But yet, on the website, Tools from Japan, it's described as sort of soft, muddy, traditional stone. Cuts relatively well, 320 grit. Did not behave anything at all like that. So, a few days passed. I had some kitchen knives that were really tore up. Edges were chipped out, had multiple faceted bevels on them, some of them quite high, 25 degrees per side, heavily impacted. I was in a bit of a whimsical mood. I said, I'm going to take this stone and use it to regrind those knives. Well, something very odd happened. As I started steadily increasing the pressure on the stone, the nature of the stone flipped. And all of a sudden, it turned into that soft, muddy, extremely abrasive stone. It started cutting very fast. I said, okay, this is weird. So I thought maybe it has something to do with the pressure, meaning it only happens at a very high pressure. So the next day, stone had dried out, put it back in water. This is not splash and go, you had to soak it. Mirror polished up the Mora again. Did a few passes on the stone again, very, very light, only about half a pound of force. That's the knife and the force that I'm putting on it. And I've been actually calculating the pressures, contact pressures lately. You can find all kinds of numerical information down in the description. I'll give a link to some discussion. But even with very, very light force, the stone cut very well. Behaved completely different than it did in the beginning. I've seen two possible explanations for that. One is that traditional Japanese stones often have some kind of sealer on them when you get them. And the other thing is the way that they make the stones can sometimes shift the binder so that the extreme edges of the stones can have very heavy binder content. So most people recommend that you lap the stones a couple of times before you really make a decision on how the stones actually cut. That's the point that I wanted to make in this short video, because I've never seen something as dramatic as how this went from being very hard, having almost no cutting ability, couldn't even cut 1095 at 60 Rockwell, to chewing through everything. And I've used it lately even on things like this. This is a knife from Faradmir in 121 Rex and around 70 Rockwell. Has no problem cutting this. So now it behaves exactly like Stu describes it. 320 grit, relatively soft, relatively muddy stone. Now, one final point that I want to make is that I've been trying to come up with some kind of an evaluation matrix as of lately, how to evaluate stones, because I understand myself how the stones work, but trying to figure out how to communicate that to somebody else is not as trivial as you might think, and I'm just going to give you one example of it. This is a Nanawa Superstone 400, so very similar grit to the Suehiro Chemical 320. Both of these are what most people would call rather soft and muddy type stones, in that as soon as you start using them, you start to get a very, very heavy slurry buildup, and you get thick piles of it that you can actually scrape off the surface of the stone in big globs, and it'll only take, say, 50 to 100 passes at relatively light forces to produce these big globs. So is it sort of accurate to say that they're both soft and muddy? Well, yes, but that doesn't tell the whole picture. If you use the Suehiro Chemical 320 as it is now, just put some water on it after soaking it and start sharpening, you get a very, very striated type finish where you can clearly see the grind lines in the knife. As the mud builds up, that sort of smears out, but only smears out a little bit. Even if you build up lots of thick mud, you still get that very harsh, very straight grind line pattern. The Nanawa Superstone 400, however, initially, this has a little bit of mud on it now that you can see, because I don't clean the stones off. There's no point to it in between use. You have to be concerned about cross-contamination, but anyway, so if I was to just spritz this with water, this is splash and go, but does benefit from around a 5 to 10 minute soak, and start sharpening it, you again see those very harsh grind lines. But almost instantly, a mud starts to form, but it's a very fine mud, and it completely blends out that harsh scratch pattern, and you get what looks like an almost shot peened type effect, and it happens instantly. You don't need a massive thick mud. It just happens almost immediately. And I can create that a little bit on the Suehiro, but it takes a massive amount of work, and you really sort of have to build up the mud and sort of try to sharpen on the mud itself, and even going through all those motions, you sort of just start to blend out the scratch lines. The Nanawa Superstone does it immediately and gives you a very random sort of pattern where you don't see distinct scratch marks. It just looks like a shot peened effect under high magnification. That means that the edge forms very differently on this stone compared to the Nanawa, and the surface finish of the primary grind looks completely different. This shows a very harsh sort of scratch pattern, and the Nanawa does not. It's very difficult to show these things on camera because they're such minute details, but this is a very heavily used and possibly one of the few knives I would describe as actually being abused. And this is the finish from the Suehiro, and you can see the scratch lines very distinctly on the blade, and they actually show the direction that I was actually using when sharpening, because they're basically perpendicular to the spine, so they run basically straight out. So I was sharpening the knife on the stone like this, and the scratch patterns form exactly that same way. If I was to put it like this, you'd actually see the scratch patterns running on that actual angle. And you can actually use that to set the scratch pattern to make the edge have the kind of slicing aggression that you want. So if you set the scratch pattern like this, the edge will be much more aggressive when you draw it towards you. If you set the scratch pattern the other way, the edge will be much more aggressive as you push it away from you. The Nanowa Superstone 400 doesn't do that at all. You don't see this kind of distinct scratch pattern. You get just a very blended out effect. And if you look at the actual edge, it also doesn't take that very distinct tooth pattern to the actual edge as well. So it's kind of interesting, and I'm still working out some kind of matrix to describe the facets of a stone, because like I said, even though it would be correct to say that this is a soft, muddy stone, that doesn't fully describe the edge it produces or the finish it produces compared to the Nanowa, which is also a soft, muddy stone. So it's an interesting problem that I've been working on lately, trying to come up with some way to describe the stone so that when I say it, someone else says, oh yeah, I know what that actually means. I know how to interpret it. And I think it's just a matter of me working with enough stones to get some kinds of decent benchmarks out.